This episode is brought to you by Brilliant, the online learning platform that allows you to learn about interesting and important topics through a fun and interactive method of teaching that enables anyone to master almost any topic, from basics to advanced, in short, easy-to-follow lessons. This is Brilliant's first principles approach, which helps you build understanding from the ground up. Each lesson is filled with hands-on problem solving that let you play with concepts, a method proven to be more effective than just watching lecture videos. I love lecture videos, but I don't really learn anything from them because I'm not doing anything. I'm just passively watching. Brilliant lets you interact with these. Plus, all the content on Brilliant has already been crafted and filtered by a team of researchers, teachers, and professionals from MIT, Caltech, Duke, Microsoft, Google, and more. Its guided lessons let you explore concepts at your own pace. I usually go pretty slow on some of the more technical ones. Like this one, I'm doing one on data analysis, exploring data visually, unlocking rental value on Airbnb. Now, there's a practical one for you. So check it out. Go to brilliant.org/skeptic to get a full 30 days free trial and 20% off your annual premium subscription. That's brilliant.org/skeptic to get your full 30-day free trial and 20% off the annual subscription. Brilliant.org/skeptic. Check it out. All right. Charan Ranganath. Is that correct? I know I should have asked you this before we started. I'm sorry.
That's all right. It's natural to forget.
Yes, I've heard. Anyway, he's a professor at the Center of Neuroscience and Department of Psychology and director of the Dynamic Memory Lab at UC Davis. For over 25 years, he has studied the mechanisms in the brain that allow us to remember past events using brain imaging techniques, computational modeling, and studies of patients with memory disorders. He's been recognized with the Guggenheim Fellowship and a Vannevar Bush Faculty Fellowship. He lives in Davis, California. Outside of neuroscience, Dr. Ranganath is a songwriter and guitarist. Look at the guitars behind him. Those are cool. And a number of recording credits, including a song on a feature film soundtrack. I didn't look up to see what that was, so you'll have to tell us what that is. But first, the new book, Why We Remember. And why did I forget to ask him about the pronunciation of his name? That's subtitled Unlocking Memory's Power to Hold On What Matters. I love that cover, by the way. It's that kind of a cloudy brain that's slipping away like our memories do.
That's
nice
right.
to see you, sir. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
It's a great book. I listened to the whole thing on audio, and I was just rereading some of it today in print. Okay. So this is really an important subject because it deals with so many important topics like the nature of the self and, and how we construct that from our memories and so on. But I'd love to get you catch us up with starting with the neuroscience of memories. How is it that just molecules swapping across synaptic gaps in neurons can generate, memories of songs and images of people and past events and so on? This just seems like a miracle happens in there. It's almost like the mind-brain problem is one of those knotty philosophical problems.
It is, and if I had an easy answer for you, I would be getting the Nobel Prize. So but I'll give you some ideas about where the field has come from and what we're thinking about right now. You can always think about any question in the mind and the brain at different levels of analysis, right? So if you go to you said the molecules, right? So you have all of these neurons that basically communicate with each other. They send out a little electrical signals, but then what happens is they send out chemical signals to other neurons that stimulate electrical activity in other neurons. And so that population level activity, meaning I got a set of neurons that are active when I just see your face, is going to be associated with the conscious experience of seeing your face. And that's just in the moment. But if I can change the strength of those synapses, the gaps where you have the connections between the neurons, basically, it's where you send out a chemical like glutamate or GABA from one neuron to another to stimulate it or inhibit it. If I can tweak those synapses to be more sensitive so that less chemical produces more of a change in activity, now it's a little bit easier for if I can activate just some of those neurons somehow, like I just see you from a distance in a crowded room or something like that, right? I just, something about you catches my eye, that can then more easily activate the other neurons that were active when I saw your face and give me this sense of, aha, that's Michael Shermer. I know him. And so that's the general idea that we have is that there's no one neuron that stores memory, but it's a population of neurons. And it's something that Donald Hebb, which I talk about in my book, called a cell assembly. So you can think of it as this little group of neurons, right? But there's different coalitions of neurons that basically are responsible for different memories, and they actually kind of overlap, right? So I use an analogy of political parties to basically say that when one group, that there's this competition between these coalitions of neurons, and essentially at any given time, one coalition could win out and the others lose, basically. And when that happens, you're going to get little shakeups in these cell assemblies so that now the most loyal neurons, so to speak, the ones that were most likely to say, hey, that's Michael Shermer, are going to be preserved and strengthened essentially as part of this coalition. But the ones that were a little bit disloyal and said, hey, this is someone else, I don't know who it is, those will drop out. And so those connections will be weakened. And that's what we think the basic mechanism of memory is. So that's why memory is a little bit different, I think, than people's intuitions, where you might think, okay, well, it's just like storing a file on my computer, but it's not, because essentially as long as I have space, I can put tons and tons of files on my computer and there's no competition between them. But with memories, you have the same groups you have overlapping groups of neurons holding on to different memories. And so what that means is that there's always going to be this competition. So remembering involves finding a way to activate the right cell assembly and beat that competition. And that's the basic gist of our kind of lower level ideas of how memory works. And then at the systems level, we can talk about all kinds of different varieties and flavors of memory.
Yeah, so this idea of a grandmother neuron, or as Christoph Koch called it, the Jennifer Aniston neuron from that one experiment he did. But that's not quite right. It's that particular neuron they were monitoring happened at that moment to be the recipient of all these neural networks firing in that particular sequence that represents the Jennifer Aniston image or whatever.
That's right. So you can find neurons that will fire in response to Jennifer Aniston. That's a very true finding, right? But that's not telling you what the whole population of neurons is doing. So imagine you have like a whole symphony and you have one piccolo player that you focus on. That piccolo player is not telling you what the whole symphony is sounding like. It's just telling you about their one little part in it. And so I think sometimes people focus on these single neurons and they say, well, this is what the neuron does, and therefore this is what the brain does. And it doesn't really work like that. So if you put computer models of groups of these neurons together, they can actually behave quite counterintuitively based on what the single neurons do, right? Just like if I were to look at one particular member of a political party, that doesn't tell me about the diversity of beliefs and opinions in that party or what the party's platform is going to be, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I like that analogy. It's a good analogy. So when I was researching my book, Heavens on Earth, about the scientific attempts to achieve immortality, cryonics and things like that, one of which was mind uploading. Okay, so, and I read about the stuff on copying the connectome. And so, but the theory behind it is based on memory. So first of all, they define the self as your memory self. Okay, we can come back to that in a minute. Mm-hmm. But the assumption is that at any given moment, there's a fixed set of memories that are stored permanently, well, relatively permanently. They're fixed in those synaptic connections, and the connectome is a copy of all your synaptic connections, and that's a copy of all your memories, and that's you. And then we make a digital file of that and upload it to the cloud or wherever we put it. Mm-hmm. Okay, none of this is even remotely possible now, but in principle, is that true? Are our memories, so here's their argument. When patients are put under, like for a heart transplant surgery or whatever, they drop the body temperature down super low. So the brain is not really functioning. It's just kind of just humming along barely. But when they bring the patient back online after anesthesia, his memories return. So they were fixed in there more or less. Is that an accurate description of how a memory or a set of your memory self could be permanently stored in some way?
Yes and no. So yes, what you're describing is kind of, obviously we're talking about things that aren't scientifically possible now, but this idea of like, if I took an exact duplicate, let's say, of the entire set of neurons in your brain and duplicated the synaptic connections between those neurons, in theory, I would be able to pull up the same memories as in my original brain, right? So in that sense, yes. But I think the key thing that I emphasize in my book, and I really emphasize this verbally, is because in neuroscience, they tend to be a little literal about memories as being a readout of something that literally happened. And in the real world, that's not how it works, and nor is that how it works in computer simulation. So a neural network, by definition, can give you essentially a massive variety of memories, so to speak, depending on what the cues are that are available. So what that means is that essentially to say that there's the memory doesn't really make sense, because it's really the memory depends on what the cue is and so forth. And when you talk about humans, it's much more complex, because really what happens is when we remember an event, which we call episodic memory, this ability to kind of mentally time travel back and re-experience the past. Really what happens is there's this little burst of activity where you have that kind of aha moment, and you can see activity in the hippocampus, which is an area of the brain that's very important for episodic memory, and all these little bits of brain activity that might correspond a little bit to what you saw, a little bit to what you heard. But then there's this process of what we call elaboration, where you take those little bits and pieces and you make a story out of it. And that story is one that you construct based not on what happened in the past, but based on your perspective of those little bits and pieces based on where you are right now. So Frederic Bartlett called remembering an imaginative construction, meaning that we're actually not replaying the past, but we're imagining how the past could have been. And that's very important, because it says that, in fact, we're never really replaying the same memory twice. And it gets even more complicated because, and I hope I'm not getting too complicated if you want me to simplify.
No, you're doing great.
I feel like for your audience, we can go a little bit higher than, we can up it. So, but what makes it even more complicated is the act of remembering itself can change the memory. So if you have memories that you've gone back to over and over and over again, you have this paradoxical thing where, on the one hand, the memory becomes easier to access and it becomes the story that you can tell so quickly. But the more you recall this memory over and over, you don't feel it as much as you used to. You don't get the sense of mental time travel where you're like vividly remembering it. It becomes more and more of a story that could have happened to anyone. And so what's happening is that every time you recall it, you're recalling it in a new context, a new place, and a new time. And so over time, what happens is the more I recall that memory, it's no longer locked into this particular moment in time. It's now kind of spread out as the story you can generally tell. And so what this means is basically every time we remember an event, we're recalling a little bit of the event, but also some bits and pieces of the times that we remembered that event. So sometimes we're remembering the event, but we're also remembering the act of remembering.
Right. You're remembering, you're retelling it, and you're changing the retelling as you go. Yeah, so we just recently lost Dan Dennett. One of my favorite metaphors was the Cartesian theater. This is a mistake people make in dualism, thinking that memories are played back on the Cartesian screen of your mind, and you just sort of watch it up there to see what happened. And it's not even remotely close to a correct analogy.
Yeah, and I think it's very tempting to get into this idea that somehow our memories or our thoughts or even our perceptions are just a complete duplicate of the world or the duplicate of our past experiences. But it's like if you tried to make that work, it would both be extremely resource demanding in our brains, and it would also be less useful. That is, like, if you just look at like perception and visual illusions and stuff, those emerge because we have brains that are trying to make sense of the world. They're not trying to, our brains aren't really designed to just say, hey, this is what's out here. It's really to give us some kind of sense of what's out there that is meaningful to us in a way so that I can reach for an object, or I can say, hey, there's some food over there. And that is how memory works. If you look at most of the brain, but in particular when you look at memory functions, it's all about less is more. And really, there's this tiny fraction of what we experience that we really do remember. And what that fraction tends to be the stuff that's the most biologically important, the stuff that's most meaningful, the stuff that's counterintuitive or surprising or novel. And everything else, you don't have to learn it because you already knew it to begin with.
Interesting. Are you familiar with Donald Hoffman's theory about perception and memory, and that we didn't evolve senses to get a veridical perception accurate model of the world, but just to reproduce whatever it takes.
Mm-hmm.
So I forget what his theory is called now, darn it. But basically we have all these icons in our brain that sort of correspond to something out there in reality, but not necessarily accurately.
Mm-hmm.
And because the point is not accuracy, it's just whatever it takes to survive.
Yeah, that's right. And what's often and this is a point that I really make is that what it takes to survive is what's useful for understanding the present and predicting the future. So we take something like episodic memory. Episodic memory is extraordinarily selective, but it tends to emphasize the stuff that is the most important to survive. It tends to emphasize the rewarding stuff, the stuff the moments that are associated with threats or fear or stress or love, attachment, or just things that violate our expectations. There's a whole literature on the hippocampus and its responsiveness to things that are surprising or novel, like being in a new city. You walk out of the airport into this new place, and those are the kinds of events that are prioritized because that's the information that you need to carry into the future.
Yeah. So while we're waxing philosophic, back to this, memory self, I also think that but what about your point of view self? The, moment to moment to moment looking out through my eyes, that's the real me. If you slid me into an MRI machine and copied my connectome and uploaded it to the cloud and slid me back out and said, well, Shermer, you're now up in the cloud, I'd say, well, no, I'm not. I'm right here. I'm standing here. That's just a copy. Right. So, and one argument to counter that is, well, there's more than one you. So that's the new definition of self, is there can be multiple you, whatever that would mean. But that's still not right, because if you did this when I was 35, what happened? Now I'm about to turn 70 this year. What happened in the next 35 years of memories? They're not up there. They're here still. So I mean, so you talk about that a little bit. Because you open your book with the experiencing self versus the remembered self. How do you define the self in this context?
Well, okay, so I'll preface this by saying the personality psychologists really get deep into the whole world of the self, and so I'm kind of a dabbler by comparison. But I'll just give you a piece of this, which is that Kahneman, and Danny Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize, he just recently passed away, came up with this idea of what he called the remembering self and the experiencing self. And the reason he did that was he said, well, when we go through life, we can experience pain, we can experience happiness, we can also just experience boredom. But when we make decisions, we don't base it on the sum total of those experiences. We base it on what we remember. And that memory is incomplete, and it reflects the highs and the lows and the beginnings and the ends, basically. And Kahneman's point is that you have this self that's actually experiencing the world, and then you have a self that reflects on the past and does it to make the decisions. So in basically what Kahneman was saying is that the remembering self calls the shots, and then the experiencing self is stuck with it. Right. And so that's what I wanted to highlight, is that when we are in the, sorry, just getting a little warm. So when we are in the act of remembering, we're almost a different person than we are when we're not in the act of remembering, when we're in the moment. And you can see this somewhat in the configurations of brain networks when people are turning inward versus when they're looking out and actually engaging with the outside world in a way that's just purely receptive, right? So that's the basic distinction there. And the point of that distinction was to say that the remembering self is different from the experiencing self because memories are incomplete. And memories are biased, and memories are emphasizing meaning over anything else. And so in that sense, yeah, they are two different people. Their experiencing self is potentially one that's in the moment and is just the sum total of our propensity to do things depending on what's going on. But the remembering self is a bit different. That's our beliefs and our episodic memories and the reasoning that we do to construct models of what's going on around us. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. I think of it like in a Wittgensteinian way of, what is a game? You try to define it very carefully, and there's always exceptions. But there's kind of a fuzzy set, a family resemblance of things, more or less. That's a game. And I think of the self as like that. Like I know everything you just said is true, and it's kind of fluid, but there is kind of a set of memories and personality characteristics and things about me that make me me, and that I think of, that's me. And if you knew me, you'd go, yeah, that's Shermer, that's who he is. And if I got Alzheimer's and I completely lost all that, you go, well, he's no longer Shermer because he's lost all that, something like that. Even though you could always find, that memory you have when you were 5 is not actually the memory. It's this. Yeah, I know, but it's roughly speaking, more or less. So just to take something like the Big Five personality, it does change a little bit over the lifespan. But I'm at this level of conscientiousness or this level of openness to experience or extroversion, and I may bounce around a little bit in the channel, but I'm more or less this set of characteristics through in my life. And you go, yeah, that's him. It's a kind of a fuzzy set.
Yeah. And I think this is why researchers who studied people with amnesia, so they have like more of a pure memory disorder. It's not like advanced Alzheimer's disease, but it's more one where they can't form new memories. And on the one hand, they don't lose their sense of who they are. There are even patients who can recall events from their past, but they don't experience it as something that happened to them. They'll just be like, this could have been something I read in a book. Oh. And those patients still have a sense of self, but it's a rather impoverished sense of self. It's not one that's evolving or developing, and it's one that's very much based on a set of beliefs or knowledge, but it's not necessarily of this richer sense. But they do have a sense of self. Now, if you look at patients with certain kind of frontal damage, that's where you get into this world of people who they're no longer themselves. So the famous example was a guy named Phineas Gage who had he was in this railroad and working on the railroad, and this railroad spike went up through his brain, damaged his orbitofrontal cortex. And afterwards, the story goes that he was engaging in all this immoral behavior, and he was very disinhibited and didn't follow society's rules. But what's buried in there is that they also said he's no longer Gage. He was no longer himself. And I've dealt with people with schizophrenia, and you get a similar kind of phenomenon where the frontal, arguably it's because of the frontal damage, that they're just not the same person they used to be. And so that seems to be core.
The family members say that?
The family members will say that, or you'll hear stories about what they were like before. I mean, I've seen this firsthand. I knew someone before and after their psychotic break, and it was just like talking to two different people. And I worked with patients when I was doing my clinical training with schizophrenia, and it's like what the person who I was talking to when I found out their life story, it was just stunning, the contrast between what I was seeing and what they had actually accomplished in their lifetime. And just out of respect, I'm not going to go into the details of these particular people, but it's like, it really, that's, I think, part of the tragedy of schizophrenia is that loss of that sense of who this person is.
Well, that's what happens with Alzheimer's patients too, right? The spouse will say, "This is no longer the person that I married." I mean, they're gone.
Yeah.
And I guess where do those memories go? Well, they don't go anywhere. They're just gone, right? Because the neurons are dead.
Yeah. Yeah. But in the early stages of Alzheimer's, like the mild cognitive impairment stage, it's not like that. They still seem like themselves, but they're just a forgetful version of themselves.
Yeah.
And if you were just to be stuck in that stage and never progress further, what would happen is your sense of who you are would be kind of crystallized around the point that you started to lose your memory. But where you start to get the real, this person's no longer the person they was, is when the damage spreads so much that it starts to affect these other areas of the brain too.
In that gray area, is there any self-awareness? Like, I don't feel like I'm myself. There's something wrong. I'm slipping away. I'm going to fight to hang on to those memories or anything like that.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely this moments early on when people have enough insight to see that they're having these memory problems, and it's definitely terrifying. The fear, in my just subjective opinion, is often especially tied to reminders of how bad the memory deficit really is. When they realize that there's something that they don't, when they have these moments where they're just disoriented, where they don't know where they are, and they're reminded of that fact. They don't realize that I just had a conversation with you 5 minutes ago. And then it's like, well, what were we talking about? I have no idea what happened. And so there's a famous patient named Clive Waring, and people can look him up on YouTube, who describes this as a very articulate patient. He actually did have frontal damage and was a little bit different than your typical amnesia patient. But Clive talks about it as like basically it's like being, his past is just dead, that there's no past. It's just this moment and nothing else.
Yeah. Like that sad scene from On Golden Pond when the Henry Fonda character got to the end of the driveway and panicked and was scared, didn't know where he was. That's pretty accurate, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you have that early to mid phase of Alzheimer's, you start to lose that sense of time and space that comes with episodic memory, right? So if you just close your eyes right now and I ask you, where are you? You can tell me where you are without looking around. You don't have to, you have the sense of where you are. I just came from Los Angeles and I was staying in a hotel, and I woke up several times in the middle of the night, but I knew where I was because I go, oh yeah, I remember going into the hotel. But if I didn't have that memory of this one experience of walking into the hotel, I might think I got kidnapped, right? I mean, it's just like amazing how much we just rely on that episodic memory to just put us in the right context at every moment without even thinking about it.
Yeah, Malcolm Gladwell had a story in one of his books about extreme alcoholics, and he had a case study that he cited of a guy that he was just so blindingly drunk that he actually got on a plane, flew to some other city, checked into a hotel, and woke up the next day and had no idea where he was or how any of this happened.
Yeah, alcohol is not great for memory, for sure. It definitely disrupts plasticity. And although there is a fascinating phenomenon with alcohol, which is that if you were to memorize certain things while you're under the influence of alcohol, to some extent, you'll have a better capability to recall that information if you're under the influence of alcohol again. You're remembering it.
Context learning, right?
Context-dependent memory.
I had 2 glasses of wine, so I have to do that again.
Yeah, and there's this whole set of studies that's been reviewed that like where they in the 70s. Of course, it was in the 70s. They give people barbiturates or they give people weed or whatever it is, and you get these context-dependent effects. But it doesn't make up for the fact that drinking is bad for memory.
Okay, your book is titled "Why We Remember." Why didn't you call it "Why We Forget"?
Well, the reason is that I said, 90, not 90, but like if you try to memorize something, you try really hard, within about 48 hours, you'd probably lose 80% of that material. And of course, there's all sorts of qualifiers to this, but there's no doubt that the overwhelming majority of what we experience will be forgotten. So asking like, why do we forget is a little bit pointless, because the default is that we will forget, right?
Yeah.
And so the real question is, why does anything stick around? And then the deeper question, which I really was more interested in, is why do we have this capability in the first place? And the reason I wanted people to think about that is because I think the default assumption in our culture is that, well, we remember because we're supposed to have this library of everything that we've ever experienced. And the data don't support that idea. There's no one who has a complete photographic memory of everything. And it's not what you'd want. It's not actually very functional for survival or even for mental health necessarily. So I'm happy to get into all those facets more. But
but it's like back to the Donald Hoffman thing about vertical perception versus survival. I mean, you had a calculation. There's how many gigabytes of information flow into our brains every hour or day or whatever. If you remembered it all, you couldn't even function. So the forgetting part is really for survival.
Yeah. I mean, I tell people that it's like, imagine I went into your house and it was all neat and there was this, it was very Marie Kondo. And I said, boy, this is just the worst decorating strategy I've ever seen. You've got all this open space. Why haven't you put more stuff in here? I'm sure you've had all this stuff in your lifetime. You probably threw it away. Why not just put it all in this room? You've got plenty of space. You got like 20-foot ceiling. Why not just go floor to ceiling with all the junk that you've ever encountered? And of course, nobody would say that's a good strategy for life because
hoarders.
You'd be except hoarders, exactly, right? And I think the default assumption is we should be memory hoarders. And the problem, I mean, among the many problems is that you'd never be able to find what you need when you need it.
Right. Yes. Okay. So let's talk about forgetting and recalling memories. Okay, so early in the book, you made a reference to a Police song. Every move you make, every
breath you take. Yeah.
Turns out that's a stalking song.
Oh, yeah, I know.
That wouldn't be accepted today. Wait a minute, what? What are you saying?
Well, people still think it's a love song, which I suppose it could be interpreted as one, but kind of
like
a
that Paul
demented
McCartney song. She was just 17, if you know what I mean. No, Paul, what do you mean? Again, not today. That's funny. So, but of course, the moment you made reference, the song just pops back into my head. Where was it?
Well, it was there, right? But you didn't have the right cue. So we talked about the example of the memory that you recall over and over and over again to the point where it's no longer tied to a particular place and time. But we also have those experiences that we do have memories for, but we just are not reminded of them. And so they sit dormant. And episodic memory in particular is interesting because it allows us to take anything that could be as different as possible and link them together based on just the fact that they were in the same context, the same place and time, right? So if you ran into a juggler into Antarctica, there's no reason to think they would go together. But you have this memory system that allows you to put together these random things because they happen. And so to be able to pull up those episodic memories, it helps if you have a reminder of that context. So the cues that tend to evoke those memories that you thought were not even existent until they popped into your head, like what you're talking about, those cues tend to be ones that are unique to a time and place in our lives. There are smells, there are songs that we listen to during one particular summer, or there are places that we haven't been to in years, and so we haven't had those reminders.
Yeah, do you know if there's anything to this study I'm always talking about, but I keep forgetting to look up, about that music you listen to when you're like 15 to 25%, that kind of, there's like an imprinting stage for music. Like for me, it's classic rock. And that's always been my favorite. Next generation, they like music from the 80s or whatever, and so on. Is there anything to that's a special kind of cue?
Yeah, I think that it relates to a number of phenomena. So one is that we tend to go back and recall events from our adolescence to early adulthood. So there's this, if you plotted a little graph and you said, tell me memories of your life, and you quantified how many memories people pull up on an average day from different periods in their life, there would be kind of a flat line and then a big bump right between like the ages of 14 and 30. So they call that the reminiscence bump, meaning that there's a particular time that people come back to over and over. And there's a number of theories, but one theory I think that a lot of people like is that those are the years where we form our sense of self. They form our sense of who we are. And so you call back those memories because that fits with your idea of who you are at that time. And so the music of that period carries special weight because it's associated with memories of those times where we felt like we got our sense of who we are. And so it becomes pretty core to our identity.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Right, because by the time you're in your 30s and 40s, you're pretty well set of who you are, and the music is just whatever it is. It's kind of just background noise. Yeah, instead of being so substantive. I just have such vivid memories of being in my 66 Ford Mustang listening to The Who or Stairway to Heaven or whatever, and it's just so vivid. But I don't have hardly any memories of listening to songs in my car when I was 40. It's just like, whatever, I don't know.
Well, we need you to be more curious about music. Then I think we'd get that.
Yeah, I know. Younger generations tell me I've missed out on a lot.
Well, I went through, I'm obsessed with music, so I go through phases. So like I went through a phase where I just got into Ethiopian music from the 1960s. And I vividly remember when I first started playing that music and we had gone on a trip, like I must have been like about 35, 40 or something. We went on a trip to Santa Cruz. And so I vividly remember that trip, and our dog rolled around in a sea lion carcass and got really smelly and stuff.
That's really funny.
Yeah. So it's not too late for you, Michael.
Yes. So I'm told. Okay. I wanted to read this little bit from Michael Gazzaniga and his split brain experiments and this thing he calls the left hemisphere interpreter. And in one experiment with a split brain patient, for example, Gazzaniga found that when presented with the word walk only to the right hemisphere, the person promptly got up and started walking. When asked why, his left hemisphere interpreter generated this explanation: I wanted to get a Coke. In another patient suffering from a memory disorder called reduplicative paramnesia, which causes victims to mix up people and places into one story to account for experiences, no matter how improbable it is. Here's an example from Gazzaniga. One such patient believed the New York hospital where she was being treated was actually her home in Maine. When her doctor how this could be her home if there were elevators in the hallway, she said, "Doctor, do you know how much it cost me to have those elevators put in?" The interpreter will go to great lengths to make sure the input it receives are woven together to make sense, even when it must make great leaps to do so. Okay, but so, the suggestion is that, well, we do this all the time. We're just constantly making up stories. But I don't have a memory disorder, so when I'm doing it, is it really the same as that? Or is all life just the left hemisphere interpreter just making up stories about the improbable things that happen in my daily life?
Well, the split brains are a special case. I would say probably your left and your right hemispheres are probably doing this, making the stories, making sense of it, right? Most of the time, we do it pretty well. Most of the time, we're fairly accurate. But it's absolutely true. What memory researchers will call that story that you told, they'd call it a fantastic confabulation, which I like that term a little bit better. It sounds cool. So, yeah. And these are basically times where there's little bits and pieces maybe of memories that are coming up, and they're just combined in a willy-nilly sort of way. And what keeps us from normally falling into confabulations is that we constrain that memory retrieval process and we constrain that interpretation. We're skeptics, basically. So I've been dying to say that to you, but it's like, and we need to be skeptical about our memories. And so you have something that pops up into your head and you're like, wait a minute, was that a fact that I heard from a reliable source, or was that a comment that I got on Facebook that, or in somebody's random Facebook feed or something? And to do that, you need to actually take a moment to pause and actually apply some executive function, so to speak, to control that process of memory retrieval and be a little skeptical. Think again, as Adam Grant would say. So, but what happens is as you get older, that capability declines a little bit. We're less likely to be as critical of our memories. It's just a little bit harder to do so. When we're stressed, when we're tired, it's harder to do so. And I kind of have this feeling that in modern life, it kind of conspires against us to be less skeptical about our memories, which is why we're so susceptible to misinformation these days.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this in the larger context of predicting human behavior and how difficult it is. There's this problem in social sciences of these, large unexplained gaps between, let's say, identical twins raised in the same environment. And they're still different in many ways. Why? There's this, the common genes, a common environment, but there's this unshared environment somehow, like this mystery.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder how much of it is just kind of the randomness of life. After the fact, if you ask me, well, why'd you do that? I'll concoct some story explanation. Well, here's why I did it. But is that really why I did it at the time? In larger context, like, why do people commit suicide? Well, I was depressed and this and that, the people that survive. But really, was it just random that, because a lot of those stories are like, I have no idea. I just got up that morning and felt that's it. I'm going to walk across the bridge if no one smiles at me. In this case, the Golden Gate Bridge story. I'm going to jump. Just there's kind of a randomness to it. Will Putin invade Ukraine? The best experts. Well, of course, if he's got his troops piled up at the border, yeah, probably. But maybe Putin himself doesn't know why he's doing what he's doing. But then he comes up with stories. Oh, well, because there's Nazis in Ukraine, whatever. And so I kind of just generally wonder how much of our lives we're just making stuff up as we go, and much of it doesn't really have a rational explanation.
Well, I think that we're making stuff up in one sense. So I'm trying to think of 3 different explanations I could give you in response, 3 different reactions I give you. But let me try this out.
Yeah.
So I think we even interpret not only the past, but we imagine the present and we imagine the future. What I mean by imagining the present is, say I'm watching a horror movie, right? This woman's walking alone down a hallway. But I'm not watching this woman walking down the hallway. I'm thinking, why is she walking alone when, why isn't she with the other people? Why did she break off from the group? Is that chainsaw wielding madman around the corner going to jump out and cut her head off? Is she going to realize that she's in imminent danger? And so just to understand what's happening in this moment, I'm jumping back and forth between the past and the future and concocting these various scenarios about what happened, right? Now, you could say, oh, you're making that up. But on average, we're pretty good at that. I mean, in general, we are decent fortune tellers. We can do a pretty good job of saying, I go to a cafe, I order some coffee. I can be pretty confident that the barista is not going to throw that coffee at my face, unless I do something to provoke him, right? But you don't know that. And so I see this in science too, where people will go like, oh, the brain's a dynamic system and it's hopeless to try to put verbal labels on what's going on in the brain and so forth. And yes, that's true. Anything that happens in the brain in any moment could be, butterfly in Vietnam did something and it's affecting what's happening in our brain activity now. And it's actually, it's a fascinating topic, but what you see in brain activity in a moment is also, there's a big component of that brain activity that's predictable from stuff that happened, seconds ago, even minutes ago sometimes. So that's all true. But we can predict certain things in the brain, and we can make statements about how things will happen in the brain in certain contexts. And we can likewise, so the science is not hopeless, in my opinion. At least if it were, you wouldn't go and see a neurologist, right? It's like the neurologist doesn't necessarily know exactly what caused you to do this behavior, but that tumor is probably a pretty good guess.
Yeah. So the brain, in a sense, is a prediction machine, constantly updating its priors, let's say, if we're going to use Bayesian language, and then adjusting its credence accordingly, and rinse and repeat over and over And that's what your day is like, is constantly making predictions.
That's right. That's right. And there's one piece to add to this, because I think this Bayesian brain idea is very popular. But what I think people sometimes don't emphasize enough is what that also means is learning is biased towards the errors in our prediction. That is, if you're developing a brain to predict and then things violate your predictions, that's the information that's most useful to actually learn. This is why, like, in information theory, they talk about this, that essentially the information gain that you get is related to how much your prediction was wrong relative to reality. And so, and this is in our theories, in fact, this is a big part of how we think learning happens in the brain and why we don't run out of capacity, is because we really learn to optimize. We optimally learn by fixing memories after errors that are made, right? It's the reason why if I'm rehearsing a play, I will learn more when I make a mistake in my line than I do if I just memorize the lines and read them out from a script.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just reading this book on Bayesian reasoning, Bayesian everything, one chapter of which was on the brain as a Bayesian machine. And then it was an interesting little factoid in there that you can't tickle yourself because the prediction is so accurate of when you're going to move and touch, and that there's no surprise to it. But that's something like a third of schizophrenics can tickle themselves. I have no idea who did this research, but I forgot to look at the source. But in any case, have you heard this?
I've not heard this, but that's interesting. I mean, there is this theory that schizophrenia, one of the positive symptoms like hallucinations and delusions come about because the brain is overly predictive and overly learning from predictions in a way that is not functional. So in other words, it's sort of like building these false coincidences and weaving them eventually over time into this knowledge that you'd call a delusion.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about recovering memories that really are there, like the Sting song popped back into my head. Okay, it was in there somewhere. You gave me the trigger, and the memory comes back. But what about false memories? You know, people that recover memories of things that actually never happened. Remember the disastrous false recovered memory movement of the 90s.
Oh, yeah. So I'll start off by saying that I think I do this, of course, I do talk about false memories even in the book, but I also say I don't really believe in true or false memories. That memories are like a painting, not like a photograph. So in a painting, yeah, if I were to do a painting of you, I might get some facts right, and I might get some bits that are just totally wrong. I might omit some pieces, and the resulting painting is going to reflect a lot of my perspective, which is neither true nor false. This is the way I'm looking at you right now, right? So that's how memory works. There are little bits and pieces that are true, so to speak, and there's bits and pieces that we fill in the blanks, and sometimes we do so incorrectly. There's missing bits, and then there's the story that we put together based on our perspective at the moment that we're constructing that memory.
Yeah.
So when I say that not to be like, yes, we live in a post-truth world, blah, 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 but we're never really remembering everything as it happened, because if this conversation, if your listeners were to remember something about it, nobody's going to recall the entire hour of our conversation. They're just going to recall a few bits and pieces of it, right? And that's going to be part of their story. So false memories you brought up, and I realize I'm kind of going around here, but
that's all right.
So the false memory bit was really interesting because, yes, you pointed out that it really became a big deal in the 80s and the 90s. And that was around this time they had a phenomenon called the Satanic Panic. And so there was a book that came out called Michelle Remembers that really ignited this. And I think there was probably also a lot of social things going on at the time that people were like freaking out because mothers were actually working and so children were on their own. And so bad things are going to happen. But there's a lot of stuff that came out from this book, Michelle Remembers, where this woman wrote this first-person account of being in therapy and recovering memories of satanic abuse, meaning that the families were in these satanic cults that were ritually abusing these children. And So at the end, I think she even sees the devil and so forth. And you look at her story, and it's kind of, she married her therapist, which is definitely not a good sign. You definitely,
Right.
as a therapist, you already know something goes wrong. But this really took shape at that point. And so there was this theory that if you have low self-esteem, if you have you engage in self-harm, if you dissociate, you must have experienced some form of abuse, typically sexual abuse. And the key is that you just need to remember it. So repressed memory therapy became the tool to do this. And the idea behind repressed memories, I start off as a therapist with the assumption, I'm well-meaning, I want you to be better, I want you to stop self-harming. So I say, hey, I know you've been abused, so it's okay. Tell me about it. And so you say, well, I don't remember being abused. I had a happy childhood.
Yeah.
So they say, well, okay, let's really try to go into it. Tell me about your childhood. Oh, wait, you had this experience where you felt uncomfortable with your parent. Tell me more about that. Do you remember anything that could have happened? Maybe imagine how this could have played out. And then you go back to this person again and again and again. And so what happens is that people might imagine something. Then the next time they come back, they remember what they imagined, but they confabulate it with something that actually did happen in the past, because they're trying to remember the past, and then they're imagining the past, and later on they're remembering the past and the stuff they imagine. And so bit by bit, you can construct a memory from all of these little bits and pieces of other memories and other experiences. What happens is I trust you because I'm coming to you for help, and you're telling me I must have been abused. And then I'm trying to recall these things, maybe even under hypnosis, or maybe even under certain kinds of medications that are dampening my executive functions, making me less skeptical of my memories. And over time, what happens is people imagine, they simulate, they pull up bits of other memories, maybe movies that they saw, maybe things that they've read, and suggestions from the therapist, and they weave it into a patchwork of a memory that becomes more and more enriched over time, to the point where they believe these experiences. And that story that I'm telling you comes directly from the research of people like Beth Loftus, who created this recipe. It's the exact recipe that you would use to implant a memory in people who, if you just wanted to inject a false memory into somebody, this is how you do it. You give misinformation from a trusted source. You ask people to imagine it over and over. You tell them, don't be critical, just let it all come out. And that's what happens. And so there was this big explosion of these things. And even there's an FBI investigator that was assigned to this spate of satanic ritual abuse cases, and eventually came to the conclusion that it wasn't happening. They had no evidence of it. And so even now today, I was talking to somebody in an interview, and they were saying, my friend is, a memory of satanic ritual abuse. And people have very real memories of being abused. I never want to gaslight anyone who's saying that. But this particular approach to repressed memory therapy is a recipe for disaster. And that is where you can really be vulnerable to false memories.
Yeah. And then, since we're on that topic, PTSD and memory, there are triggers in the environment that apparently bring back these dark memories of conflict and so forth.
Yeah. So, classic symptoms of PTSD are dissociation, are flashbacks, night sweats, nightmares, sleep disruption, the whole 9 yards. But one big characteristic of PTSD is that the traumatic memories are brought up at constantly throughout. The slightest reminder can bring these things up. So when I was working at the VA hospital and I was doing therapy work with PTSD patients from the Vietnam War, 4th of July was a really problematic time for them, because they would hear a firework and they would feel like they were back in Vietnam. It would bring back that context into their mind. And so you say, well, why in the world would this happen to people? What's wrong with our brains? But if you think about it, right, it's like I go to a cave and I get attacked by a bear. Again, if you're trying to design a brain for survival, You want to be reminded when you see that cave, hey, don't go there. There was a bear there that attacked me. You might even want to err on the side of caution and say, when anything even resembles that cave, let's go ahead and tell you you're under threat. Because on average, you'll be more likely to avoid a threat even if you have a bunch of false alarms. And so what one theory of PTSD is that, in fact, that this context becomes of the fear or the trauma event becomes overgeneralized, and it can become overgeneralized for a number of reasons. So one could be that the chronic stress actually affects the hippocampus and makes it less likely to form these highly specific memories. Another is that if I recall a traumatic memory in a new context, now, as I pointed out, the memory can become updated and it's now associated with a new place. And then what happens is that the trauma can snowball where you recall it in a new place, and it now can happen anywhere. That traumatic memory can always pop up.
And so when you treat it with something like cognitive behavior therapy, are you essentially not changing the memory, but changing the context cues?
Well, you can't change the context cues per se, but the behavior therapy part of it is actually so there's the cognitive part and there's the behavioral part. The cognitive part is changing people's beliefs or addressing people's beliefs about the memory, because essentially if you have a traumatic memory, there's three key ingredients. There's that, we'll just lump it for now, the content and the context of the actual event itself. There's sort of the what happened, where did it happen, when did it happen. Then there's the visceral kind of emotions that come with it, but also the physical sensations of your heart racing, your eyes dilating, and so forth. The feeling of being there. And that feeling is what gives us the sense of vivid remembering, even when we don't have a lot of content to come up with. And on the other hand, if we have a lot of that content, but we don't have that feeling, we don't necessarily feel like we vividly remember. Then there's the third part, which is the interpretation, the story that we put on these past events. And so when people tell me, how can I forget? I've endured these horrible experiences. What I tell them with as much empathy as I possibly can is, you don't want to forget what happened, but you want to be able to change your relationship with what happened. You want to be able to get that information, the content and the context, but without this mass fear response and without this like interpretations of shame and guilt. And so that's what cognitive therapy is all about. It's about addressing some of the visceral symptoms and habituating people to them, and about changing people, giving people a different perspective. And one of the cool things about therapy is it really harnesses that ability that we have to update memories, because just the act of you're telling me this horrible experience that you have that you've never told anyone about before changes your memory just a little bit, because just to make it interpretable to me, you had to tell it to me in a particular way that's different than the loop that you have in your head. Now I feed back. Now I have a memory of something that I've never even experienced based on what you told me. And I'm constructing that from my own perspective, and I feed that back to you, but I see it completely differently. You have this feeling of being terrified, and I'm seeing somebody who is really courageous. You see somebody who's responsible for the deaths of all these people around you, let's say if it was a Vietnam vet, and I see somebody who was in a no-win situation who couldn't have done anything any differently because you didn't know what the right thing to do was at that time. And so that's the cognitive part, is really, it's again, encouraging people to be skeptical, but you're not just saying you're wrong. You're saying, here's my perspective. Have you considered this perspective? And once I do that, now your memory incorporates a little bit of that interaction. It's no longer yours. It's now ours. And so that's where group therapy is so powerful, because what happens is a bunch of people start sharing their memories, and they all overlap in certain ways. And 10 people who are Vietnam vets each have their own unique experience, but they're connecting on this shared bit. And the key part of this is not to just wallow in the trauma. You don't want to just go, yes, tell me more. How bad was it? That's not what you want to do. What you want to do is you want to be able to frame it from an outside perspective. Say, hey, how can we look at this differently? Because even though the emotion, the interpretation and the content are separate, they are related to each other. Like if I were to, if somebody came in here with a knife, my heart would be racing, my eyes would be dilating, I'd get a fight-flight response. But if I were to go skydiving and jump out of a plane, my eyes would be dilating, my heart would be racing. You get a lot of that same fight-flight response, but my interpretation is, yay, I'm going skydiving, as opposed to I'm about to be murdered by this guy. So that's an example of how powerful the interpretation is.
Yeah. I was just back at Harvard last week visiting with Steven Pinker and Rich McNally.
Oh, yeah.
And McNally and I were talking about his research on trigger warnings, because that's back in the news now with all the campus craziness. And that, he did that research showing that, trigger warnings are, not only do they not work, sometimes they can make things even worse in terms of triggering a dark memory or something bad.
Yeah. I think that, I mean, I guess I have mixed feelings about these kinds of things, because I think that it is difficult for people especially with PTSD. And keep in mind, by the way, that if you look at any kind of a big mass trauma, like people who were healthcare workers during COVID or people who were first responders during 9/11, the majority do not get PTSD. They have a horrible memory of something, but they're not haunted by this post-traumatic stress disorder. We don't know why. We don't know what makes people different from each other in terms of their stress responses. It's not like one person's weak and one person's strong. It's just the differences in the way the brain are wired. One seems to be wired with a brain that's erring on the side of interpreting threats to keep you alive. It might be a brain that's more likely to survive in the long run in a dangerous world, right? So that's the way that our brains are set up. And so, for some people, certain cues are going to be more triggering and so forth. But I don't know that necessarily we can live in a world where we can avoid these reminders of traumas. I think, and especially with something like PTSD, the whole problem is that anything can be a reminder.
Yeah. Reading your book, I was reminded of that story of Ronald Cotton, who was falsely accused of rape by Jennifer, whose last name I forgot.
Thompson, I think.
Thompson, yes. Yeah. Jennifer Thompson, yes. Yeah, thank you. And I met them at a conference where we were all speaking, and they were kind of on the road campaigning, kind of active campaigning about false accusations and how these police lineups are presented, and so forth. How did she make such an error? And one of the powerful things she said was that that Ronald Cotton, by the time she had decided he was the rapist, that was the new memory. The person that actually raped her, Bobby Poole, his face is gone. It's not in there anymore, and it's Ronald Cotton's face. That's the new memory. I remember thinking, that's powerful. So, and then she has to readjust on that and form yet another memory of the correct perpetrator.
Yeah, and I actually talk about that case in detail in the book, because essentially it was just, again, a textbook case of how people's memories can become corrupted. Because at least according to her account, which again, memory can be a little suspect, but according to her account, when she was first shown pictures of possible perpetrators, she wasn't sure. And in general, when people, they just get the first retrieval cue, first time they're being cued to remember something, in general, if they're like, I'm sure this is the person, they're usually going to be correct about something. They'll usually be correct that they've seen this person before or something. But she wasn't. And then then they did it again, and they repeated Cotton in the same, in a new lineup. And then she was confident that she had seen him, because she did see him, but she saw him in the previous lineup. And so what happens is, just over time, there's this chain of events that corrupts her memory more and more. And it's exacerbated by the fact that there's this well-known cross-race bias in face recognition, where people who are white, for instance, have significantly harder times discriminating in memory between faces of people of opposite races who would otherwise be discriminable. Does that make, I said it in a weird way.
Sense.
Yeah. And it turned out that Bobby Poole was, by many people's opinions, somebody who did look like Ron Cotton, which did not help the situation at all.
Yeah, right. Okay. Let's talk about some other fun topics. Deja vu experiences. We've all had them. Let me just see if I get it right. So a brain's a prediction model, right? So you get a handful of cues that are very similar to other cues that you've had in the past. And that triggers a memory of that model or that person or the town or whatever it is. Close enough. Something like that, like a fuzzy set of characteristics that constitutes that memory. It triggers that neural network to fire. So you get the Jennifer Aniston neuron firing or whatever, or this person's face that's close enough.
Yeah, exactly. And it's thought to be related to the general feeling of familiarity that we have and use routinely to guide like quick assessments. Like I show you a face and I say, is this person famous? And I do an example of this in my class where I'll show people a yearbook photo of somebody who's like a famous like rapper and somebody else who's not. And there's a random person who I found on the internet. And people can tell the rapper, even if they don't know who it is, they'll go, that person seems more familiar to me, right? So there's this quick and dirty assessment that we can get that's based on how much of a match information is to what we've already encountered. But that's kind of an average. It's a quick and dirty sense of what happens, and it's very quick. So we know that there are patients, for instance, who have epilepsy, and right before a seizure, they will have an intense sense of deja vu. And it turns out my friend Stefan Kohler did a study of patients who had this deja vu epilepsy. And it turned out that they actually had a very hard time with familiarity because everything seemed kind of familiar to them. And so they couldn't tell things that they'd actually seen from things that they hadn't seen. So it seemed to be this electrical activity in these networks that were really driving the sense of familiarity in particular, and they're getting all these false matches. And so meanwhile, there's other people like Anne Cleary who've done really cool work where she's created these virtual reality environments. And this speaks to the exact point that you were making. So imagine you go through this virtual reality like video arcade, right? So she'll take the same floor plan and the same locations of all landmarks, but make it into a museum. So it looks different, but it's the same structure of the place. And I've seen these stimuli and I know the purpose of this experiment, but when I go through the museum, I'm not at all remembering consciously the video arcade. But what happens to people is that they get the sense of deja vu because something's matching, but there's enough that's mismatching that you go, this can't be something that actually is a memory. So you're getting this weird partial match that's giving you that sense of familiarity, but your brain has got enough information to say, this is not anything that I've seen before at the same time.
Interesting. I had some interesting deja vu experiences the first time I rode across America on my bike and raced across America, that I felt like I knew what was coming up in the upcoming town. Like, oh, I know I've been here before, but I've never even been in this state. It's not possible. And I got to thinking, all these Midwestern towns, they all have like a Denny's and then a corn silo and a gas station over here and the local cafe. And they're not that dissimilar. And I got to thinking maybe that's a kind of deja vu. Like, I've been here before. Well, I've been at a town that looks something like this before. And, I'm half sleep deprived anyway, so everything's kind of weird. So, that was that kind of sense. And then I thought, I wonder if that's true. If I see somebody that looks kind of familiar and you do that like double take and triple take, you look like, have we met? And what I'm doing when I'm doing that is trying to collect more data to see the accurate prediction of the model that's in my brain of that person's face. I'm getting more points there to see if there's a match or not.
That's right. Yeah. And we all have this, like if you see somebody who works, let's say at the supermarket that you shop at or something, and then you see them in the wild, like at a bus stop or something like that, and you see them and you're like, the context is wrong, but I have seen this person somewhere before, haven't I? And you just need to keep looking, and then there's this moment of awkwardness, and then sometimes you get lucky and then they save you. They remind you of who they are.
Oh, you,
That's right.
you.
I remember seeing you at that thing.
The thing, yeah. Yeah. And is there something different between visual memories and linguistic memories? You know, that actor, you know, the guy that was in The Godfather and he was in this other movie. And then, come on, give me the name. Robert De Niro. Oh, yeah, yeah. Why is it so easy to recall the visual face of the actor, but not the name?
Well, the name is really so. Keep in mind that what happens is that the problem when people say I'm good with names, but I'm good with faces, but I'm terrible at names. What they're really telling me is they're good with faces, but they're terrible at associating names with faces, right? So it's like the name Arnold is associated with many people, not just Arnold Schwarzenegger, and so people have a mental representation of Arnold in their head, but to learn this guy is named Arnold, you have to associate it with this face, which is just totally arbitrary. So, and it's amazing how many people will just tell me this, especially as they get older, they have trouble with proper nouns. So I did Fresh Air with Terry Gross, and Terry, who never talks about herself, spent a long time telling me about her difficulty with proper nouns. It's an enormously common problem because proper nouns make no sense. There's no reason you should be named Michael other than the fact that you are. It's totally arbitrary. So the problem is not the visual versus the auditory in the case of the name or whatever. It's more just because there's nothing sensible to link the two. But what's really interesting, and to be honest, we don't still fully understand it, is I know of you from your work with Skeptic and from the books that you've written and so forth. And that makes it a lot easier to associate the name with the face. And my memory for your name and associating with your face will be better than it would be for a random person because I have this extra knowledge that I can lock into.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, another fun example. So when I started playing piano when I was 8, piano lessons from the parents, of course, and I kept it up through college, and then maybe a year or two after, when I was single, you know, dating, whatever, I'd play the dozen or so songs I had memorized, and that was always big fun. And then I didn't do it for decades. And then I sat down, you know, for release, here it is, I could play this. And, you know, after the first 10 notes or something, it's gone. Is it gone forever? I mean, if you didn't play guitar for the next 20 years, would it be gone or is it in there somewhere?
Well, you know, one of the interesting things about the study of memory in general is that there's often there's many cases where people can't recall something, but they'll find it easier to learn the second time around. Okay. So Ebbinghaus, who did the first quantitative studies of memory, he didn't actually quantify forgetting in terms of how his inability to remember things that he had memorized. He actually quantified it in terms of how quickly could he relearn the same information that he had tried to memorize before. And so what you might find is that you might not remember how to play that song, but if you were to, you know, be given, here's the notes and so forth, you'd find it easier to memorize it the second time around. And that's especially the case with things like procedural memory, which would be things like motor skills, like playing music and so forth.
Right. So maybe the pathway is sort of in there still, and you're just rehearsing it more rather than learning it.
Well, sometimes you have to repair it because repair it. Yeah, okay. Like essentially you've got some noise in that memory that accumulates over time because of all these other competing memories that you've been acquiring, for instance. The context is also different, and maybe as a result, you have trouble pulling up that whole right set of motor programs. And so all these factors come into play, but essentially there's enough remnants there of the original motor program to be able to fix it, which would be what you're doing when you're learning.
Yeah. Okay, flashbulb memories. Where were you on 9/11? Where were you when Kennedy was assassinated? I swear I have this memory. I was in 3rd grade when Kennedy was killed, that we were all taken outside to the the playground where the flag was, and we did something out there. I have really no idea if that actually happened, but it's a great story I've told people.
Yeah. And it's like, so the idea of a flashbulb memory, just in case people don't know, is that if there's something that's especially a shared public event that's so significant that you remember it and it's burned in your brain, right? And people have conflated that a little bit with emotional memories, where emotional arousal is thought to just kind of burn things in your brain, like the traumas that we've talked about. And what we know now is that, in fact, even these emotionally arousing memories, it's not that the whole memory becomes stronger. It's not like we remember everything better, but we remember the things that were the most attention grabbing, the most emotionally relevant stuff, and not so much the stuff that's kind of irrelevant that we weren't paying attention to. So with flashbulb memories, what we know is that people will definitely remember that 9/11 happened. People will definitely remember that the COVID pandemic happened, for instance, but they don't necessarily accurately remember the context in which they learned it. They don't necessarily remember where and when this, or where they were when they first heard this and who they were with.
Yeah.
And
See,
they probably do remember.
I swear I was in my car picking up my daughter's friend to take the two of them to school that Tuesday morning. In the driveway, on the news comes this story. But maybe that's not accurate.
Well, I think people, so there's conflicting stories on this. Some would suggest that it's very inaccurate. Some would suggest it's pretty accurate, or more accurate than a non-flashbulb memory. And to be honest, I think it's hard to say. But I think one thing that is clear, the one thing that was done in this beautiful study that was done by many, many memory researchers on 9/11 was they documented something called the Michael Moore effect, where essentially 2 years after the 9/11 attack, I might be getting some of the details of this experiment wrong, but I'll remember the gist properly. But let's say 2 years after the original 9/11 attack, people would remember hearing about it from seeing, or they would remember that at the time that it happened, that George Bush was on TV doing a thing with school children when he got interrupted by the news about the 9/11 attack. But the thing is that this was on some public access program. Very few people had actually watched it during the time, but it became famous with Fahrenheit 9/11, the movie that Michael Moore made. And then it became burned in everyone's brains that when the news of 9/11 came in, that W was actually doing this thing with this class. And then he was just like totally stunned by this news. And so people incorporated that knowledge, because what happens is when we reconstruct the past, we're doing it from what we know in the present, right? And that's why we have so much hindsight bias, because we imagine that our past self must have known what we know now. And that becomes part of the narrative that we create.
Yeah. Yeah, like that story of people that said they heard about Pearl Harbor being bombed while listening to a baseball game. Not possible, because there's no baseball in December. Yeah, the Yankees were just no, they weren't. Okay, so I'm about to turn 70 this year, as I mentioned. I'd say in the last 5 years or so, I've been feeling much more nostalgic about just stuff in my 20s and 30s and 40s. And, oh, yeah, I wonder what happened to these people. And kind of going through my old photo books. And I don't know, it's just, and it's mostly fond memories. What happened to all the, because it wasn't always fun. There was a lot of, not great memories. Where did those go? Is there a nostalgia effect about looking back at the past?
Yeah. It's actually pretty well documented that on average, as people get older, and especially as they approach their senior years, they become more optimistic. So they have an optimism bias. And when they remember the past, they remember, this is generally true of people, that on average, people tend to have a bias to remember positive events. And they have a bias to remember the event itself and their role in the event more positively than it really was. And that propensity increases with age. And especially as people get, as they reach their senior years, they engage in a lot of nostalgia because of that. So it's not clear. My friend Mara Mather has some theories as to why this happens, because it's kind of puzzling why it happens, but it's definitely a thing, and it's great because it's actually good for your mood. There's definitely engaging in nostalgia properly can actually be very good for your sense of well-being in the present. But it can also be toxic if you engage in nostalgia and then you say, look at me now and look at how great things were back then. Or you say, look at America was so...
We need to make America great again, like in the 1950s.
Exactly,
what?
yeah. I mean, when people say that, I think, like, I was around during the 1970s, and I definitely do not want to live through that again. Oh, my God.
No more bell bottoms.
Exactly.
Or shag haircuts, or the mullet. The mullet was maybe 80s.
80s, yeah.
Anyway, it was still
80s.
awful.
Yeah.
Yeah, you should see my graduation picture at Pepperdine University in 1976. My mom and I are both wearing bell bottoms. It's just so cringeworthy. Oh, my God. Yeah. So what's the theory behind it? I mean, yeah, it makes you feel good, but there's a deeper theory about the nostalgia.
Well, so I have to read the paper, which is why I'm a little reticent to tell you about a paper that I haven't read, but I've talked to Mara about this. And so if you want, I could send you the paper and you could link to it for people. But it's basically something about the way that there's these neurochemical changes as you get older. And she places a lot on norepinephrine or noradrenaline, which is this one chemical, being less sensitive as people get older. And that basically there's a rewiring that happens to the brain as a consequence of this reduction in noradrenergic activity. So it's like a feedback type mechanism. And that leads to this more positive memory bias as a result.
Yeah. Also, so I want to talk about the idea of the extended mind and to what extent we use other people or communities to hold our memories for us. And do you think that's going to change with social media and smartphones and all that, and AI and that sort of thing?
I think it already has. I think that we're seeing it as we speak. And I mean, realistically speaking, that extended mind has been there with other kinds of media, right? So one of the things I talk about in the book is that a big factor, I believe, of course you don't know, but I believe a big factor in the evolution of language was to share memories. Because if I've been like, I got attacked by that bear in the cave that I keep talking to you about, I can tell you about it, and then you don't have to make the same mistake I did because you have a memory, but not something of your experience, but something that I've shared with you. And so human communication lends itself to this transformation of memories where they lose individuality. They take on a life of their own and become extended, as you put it. That now you have a memory for something that I've shared with you. You share that with someone else. And so what can happen is through these group dynamics, there's a collective memory that starts to take hold. And one of the things I talk about in the book is the dynamics of those collective memories follow some of the rules of individual memories, but they really exacerbate a lot of the problems. So you, me, someone else, we all watch the same political debate. Then we talk to each other about it. And what starts to happen often is that as a group, we will remember less of the details of the debate than individually we would have remembered. And what happens is this is because we sort of converge on this common story. And the individual bits that I would remember are now lost. They're sort of pruned away. And the individual bits that you remember, but I wouldn't have necessarily caught, those get pruned away. And so it takes on this collective nature where the shared stuff gets emphasized at the expense of the idiosyncrasies of your and my memory. And that tendency tends to be dominant by whoever is talking the most, and whoever, it's usually going to be, for lack of a better word, the white guy, loud white guy in the room who's like dominating the conversation. And so what happens is that collective memories can often actually be, intuitively, you'd think 5 people remembering the same debate, we would get better information by sharing those memories with each other. But in fact, it's often worse. And it's also, the problem is magnified because misinformation starts to creep in, where if I remember something that didn't necessarily happen, I've kind of made some inferences about things that weren't really there, then I tell you, and then you remember, you incorporate my misinformation into your memory, and it spreads. They actually call it social contagion. The idea is it spreads like a virus through these social networks.
The cheering Muslims on 9/11?
That's right, yeah. Yeah, yeah. And people talk about this with things like the Mandela effect, where people were convinced that Mandela died in prison and so forth. That's a popular, less.
Okay, memory enhancement. What works, what doesn't? Should I do Sudoku puzzles and play chess online against my computer? Any of those supplements I see advertised constantly to improve my memory? Does any of that work?
Well, I have two answers to this. One answer is the placebo effect is very real. So you can see placebo effects at all sorts of crazy studies where you wouldn't expect them to be, like, you know, drugs for Parkinson's disease or whatever. I don't know if that's been, but anyway. But the point is a very real effect. So if you're doing something and you might as well believe it if you're doing it, because you're depriving yourself of probably 10% of the benefit at least otherwise. But I would say that no, some supplements can have some beneficial effects, but these effects tend to be pretty small. Which means that basically these are averages, and it may improve your functioning and it may hurt my functioning as you average them together. And sometimes some supplements, there's a very recent study that came out suggesting that one particular multivitamin supplement improved cognition, or it reduced the dropping of cognition with age. And it wasn't clear exactly why, and it wasn't clear, you know, so there wasn't a mechanism in place, but it wasn't a gigantic effect, right? So likewise, playing Sudoku, there's nothing in playing Sudoku in and of itself that would necessarily improve your memory. But I think there's aspects of engagement that people have with the world that doing Sudoku keeps you challenged, keeps you energized, then great. I wouldn't say if you hate Sudoku, play Sudoku anyway, and that's going to improve your memory. It's just going to stress you out and reduce your functioning altogether. And as a memory researcher, I kind of get a little like depressed answering these questions because it's like the answers are really not memory related. They're not memory specific. Your brain's a body part, and your mental health is related to your brain functioning. So anything that's good for your mental health and your physical health is on average going to be good for your memory and your ability to retain memory over time. So I could tell you, yes, you could take the supplement and it will improve your ability to retain information over time. You take the supplement. But if I tell you, here's like 6 lifestyle factors you can do that are going to help you retain your memory, we know that these things work, and yet people don't do it. And so that's the lowest hanging fruit. And for so many reasons. So like there was a study that I talk about in the book where 29,000 people were studied, and they just identified 6 lifestyle factors in the most crude way possible. So it was like not smoking, not drinking, healthy diet, social engagement, what they called cognitive engagement, which, you know, all these things are very crude. But what they did was they said, here's some people who showed 4 to 6 of these lifestyle factors, and here's some people who showed 0 to 1 of these lifestyle factors. And when they started the study, everybody was on average about the same. But when they ended the study 10 years later, the people who had the favorable lifestyles had memory scores that were almost twice as high as the ones in the unfavorable group, right? So these are lifestyle changes that people can make, and they don't have to be that extreme. That can fundamentally affect your functioning. And we're not just talking about like Alzheimer's, we're also talking about reducing your risk for vascular dementia, for all sorts of autoimmune things that are going on and so forth. I'm just giving you the tip of the iceberg.
Sleep, exercise.
But they also improve your well-being in the present. And that's the other part of it, right? I mean, so it's like a win-win. But so that's what I would tell people. Those are the biggest things. And one thing we're finding now is social engagement seems to be very crucial. We're seeing this with studies of superagers, for instance, is that sometimes they don't have good diets or exercise so forth, but they seem to have a stable social network, and they seem to have like very satisfying social relationships. And as we've talked about with the extended memories and the extended self, one thing that has been found is with couples, for instance, who are in like committed close relationships, they can often compensate for each other's cognitive deficits because they remember these things together. And so there's just beautiful transcripts of these research studies where somebody will go like, the husband will be like, do you remember that play we attended? And then the wife will say, yeah, that's right. We had just had that terrible seafood dinner right beforehand, and you were burping throughout the thing. And then the guy says, oh, yeah, and I remember that, Liam Neeson was in the play. And so they go back and forth, and they construct this very rich picture that's bigger than the sum of their parts.
That's really funny.
So, yeah. So I think that social engagement is just a huge thing. And then I'll just say very quickly, mental health. I can't emphasize this enough. When I was doing my neuropsych training, I tested some people with clinical depression who cognitively were worse off than people who are in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. It can really have an effect. And in older adults, it's quite common and can have severe effects on memory and cognition.
Do you mean you don't mean just sadness? I mean really serious depression.
Serious depression, clinical depression. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we all are going to be sad from time to time.
And are they really
clinical depression
losing memories, or are they just so overwhelmed by sadness they can't think of in detail of other things, of anything?
Well, in the real world, they do have memory problems, but they have memory problems not because they're not capable of forming memories, but because what you can see is that their frontal function, for instance, their executive functions are just wiped out. There's other factors like sleep deficits are another factor that's very characteristic. They're not getting enough sleep, which means that they're both not benefiting from the brain activity that happens during sleep, but then on top of it, they're also sleep deprived, and so they're not being able to, their attention's shot. Then on top of it, they're ruminating and they're going inside and they're completely disengaged from the outside world. So all of these factors can mean that they're not only having memory deficits, but they're also having attention deficits that are also cognitively inflexible. And so it can be much worse than early classic mild cognitive impairment, which is mainly amnesia.
Right. Okay, let's just wrap up here with a big picture going forward. Companies like Neuralink and a lot of the transhumanists are always telling me, Shermer, don't you want to live to be 500? It's like, just get me to 100 without Alzheimer's, just so I know who I am. I'll be happy with that. But, this is that kind of almost science fiction stuff, but we're getting there. I mean, they're planting chips in brains and things like that. What are your thoughts on, to what extent we can extend our memory and our cognitive abilities through AI?
Well, I think that the important thing to keep in mind is that human memory works very differently than machine memory. And what I mean by that is that we have many different forms of memory, and it's not just, it doesn't work necessarily like AI. I mean, if you think about the carbon footprint of ChatGPT, for instance, it's gigantic compared to the cognitive footprint of a human brain, right? I mean, some of the estimates suggest we're using 12 to 20 watts.
Yeah.
That's nothing, right? So try powering more than like a few light bulbs with that. And so that's the human brain. It's extraordinarily efficient. And we're very flexible. So there's all sorts of issues with AI in terms of just requiring gobs and gobs of training data. And one of the problems you have in AI is this problem of continual learning, where basically it's like once these AI systems learn new information, they can forget the old information. And so it's really difficult to learn new stuff without losing the old stuff. And so, as I argue in the book, episodic memory is this human capability that we have that's very different from semantic memory, which is knowledge about the world. So essentially, like ChatGPT has no experiences in the world and it has no episodic memory. And so it's just getting this rough statistical average, this number crunching of everything that it's been exposed to. And to some extent, that resembles our own knowledge about the world, but there's some big differences because we're physically interacting with the world. But we also have this episodic memory for this one thing that happened to us. And so that gives us this enormous flexibility because I could say, yes, I love this restaurant, but the last time I ate there, I saw this under new management sign and the food was terrible and I'm not going back there. And ChatGPT would continue to recommend this restaurant to you over and over and over again because it doesn't have episodic memory. So I guess what I would say is that we need to understand how memory works, period, before we can start to, I think that where Neuralink has really excelled is in the engineering. And engineering is about problem solving, but I think science is about figuring out what the problem is in the first place.
So IBM's Deep Blue does not have fond memories with nostalgia of beating Gary Kasparov in chess. Oh, I remember the day I beat Gary Kasparov.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It just beat it and is just as unhappy as it was before.
Or Watson winning Jeopardy. Oh, I beat the great Ken Jennings.
That's right.
Doesn't even know it's playing Jeopardy. Yeah, that's wild. All right, Charan, that was a great conversation. Your book is really great. What are you working on now? I see you had some papers about the hippocampus and memory or something. Technical papers, I mean.
Oh, yeah. We're doing a lot with the hippocampus, but also I think it's the concepts that I'm really excited about now are coming from a lot of our computational models, where we're taking biologically based models of here's these rough ideas of connections between different areas of the brain, and then seeing how can we simulate human learning based on these things. It reveals all sorts of emergent properties about how brains must work that are basic principles, and it also debunks a lot of people's intuitions, like about the Jennifer Aniston cells, for instance. Yeah. And so that's been really, I love these periods in my life where I'm exposed to something that challenges my entire way of thinking about things. And I think I'll just give you one of my latest things, which is we have this computer model that basically says, if I have the prefrontal cortex and it's kind of controlling the flow of information through the hippocampus and these other brain areas, because I've got a goal in mind, I'm trying to remember something specific, or I'm trying to focus on specific piece of information, what you can see is that the actual observed function of the hippocampus changes, so that what you see in the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex is not the sum of their parts. And I think in neuroscience, everybody knows that an interaction is different than two independent effects, right? So it's like you are kind of not the same person when you're talking to your family as you are when you're talking to me in your podcast, right? You've got different contexts. You're engaging different parts of yourself. And brain areas are like this too. When two brain areas are interacting with each other, the function that you would observe as an outside neuroscientist looking at these neurons changes. And so what that told me is, if I want to study navigation, I don't look at a rat that's running around in a box chasing food pellets. I actually study a rat that's in the real world that's trying to actually reach a goal based on some kind of motivations it has, because those functions are going to be different. And we're even seeing this now as we've become more naturalistic in our memory experiments, like looking at memory for movies instead of like just little lists of words. And the whole story of the way brain areas work and interact has changed quite a bit. And without boring your listeners with more details, I'll just leave it at that.
That's super interesting. Yeah. Well, okay. All right. That's a good place to end. I'll hit the stop button there. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to me. Really important work. Really important. Solve these problems before I hit the wall. I'm a baby boomer. We're all going.
All right. I'm doing my best.
All right.